Okay, everybody. Thank you so much for coming and for being here for a lovely guest. And I'm very happy to be able to introduce you to Hanna Teichler. She's a postdoctoral research associate at the Department of English and American Studies at Goethe University, Frankfurt. And she holds a PhD from the Department of Anglophone Literatures and Cultures, also from Goethe University, Frankfurt, and an MA in English and Romance Studies. Her research interests include Anglophone world literature, memory studies, oceanic literatures and cultures, ecofiction and environmental studies, as well as post-colonial literatures. She's the co-editor of the book series Mobilizing Memories and of the handbook series in Memory Studies, and she co-directs the Frankfurt Memory Studies platform with Astrid Earl, which we already read some of her texts. In 2023, Hanna co-founded a new journal of memory studies, the Memory Studies Review, and now she's going to talk a lot about her current research, and I hope that you're all going to get a lot from that and that you'll ask a lot of questions afterwards.
Thank you. Thank you, Christina and Ece, for having me, for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here specifically because I have been for the past 3 months stuck in my home office, or at my home office, writing my Habilitation, which I'm going to present to you today, at least in the rough outlines. So I'm really happy to be among people, so to speak, in my professional capacity here. And as Christina already said, I'm going to introduce you to a certain, perhaps, development that cultural memory studies has gone through in the past few years. Introduce you to a specific mode of cultural memory that I am carving out in my Habilitation, a specific method of doing memory research, which I again frame as the Transoceanic, and a certain sense of memory material that derives from this Transoceanic perspective, right? By way of introducing the notion of the Transoceanic, as I've already been hinting at, I would like to show you how the understanding of how cultural memory works, perhaps after the Anthropocene turn works, right? So, in my research, or in my Habilitation, I'm interested in the following 3 aspects or paradigms. On the one hand, I'm interested in how people frame their experience in and of time, which I reference here as temporality. And of course, for me, memory studies is precisely that, the way individuals and collectives make sense of their existence in time, right? And the modes, the materials, and again, the agencies that are able to frame existence in time and experiences of time. On the other hand, I'm interested in how narrative, one of the obviously basic functions of literature, right, contributes to that, situating oneself in time, or collectives in time. And how do we treat singular literary texts? I'm going to talk about that a little bit. These kind of singular events, singular literary aesthetics, how do we read them as a sense of collective remembering, as a way of framing that? And what are kind of the narrative paradigms, the narrative constructs, and so on and so forth, that play into that idea? And on the bottom left side, you can read the word environment, which of course is a broad category in and of itself. In this particular research, I'm interested in the oceanic dimensions of environment, but of course you can also understand that in a more metaphorical terms of, what are the memory environments, perhaps, into which we inscribe ourselves, or into which we are actually born into, raised into, acculturated, so to speak, into. And, by way of triangulating these 3 aspects, I've coined the notion of transoceanic memory, and you can already guess this is a huge concept, right? But what I'm not trying to do here is, produce the super theory or the super concept that's going to explain anything and everything, in memory research and environmental research. No, it's supposed to highlight a certain, change in perspective, a certain change in understanding, again, how collective cultural memory works, and how perhaps also research contexts and cultures have changed through the introduction of the Anthropocene and related concepts, right? To break this down into more perhaps relatable questions, as I understand that you are MA and BA students, some PhD students here, for you to understand what it actually means or what drives the research or the research field that is named collective or cultural memory, right? These questions I stole from the homepage of the Memory Studies Association because we've already, used our brain power to frame these questions. Hence, I also recommend to you go to the webpage, look at, the institutionalized form of memory research. And again, here we frame ourselves in the following manner. So we're interested in researching how do we represent the past to ourselves and to others, which of the many pasts do we represent, and when, where, and why do we change those representations, right? How do these representations shape our actions, identities, and understandings, specifically also of time? How do individual level processes interact with collective ones? Of course, this is the crux, right, of collective or cultural memory studies, and vice versa. And in what ways are we ethically and politically obligated to remember? And what are the consequences of us failing to meet these obligations or simply neglecting to meet these obligations, right? And in terms of, an environmentally infused notion of collective memory, what role do environmental forms and environmental agency play in the process of remembering? Okay? So let me start with providing you with some case studies, or at least examples, which made me think about these transoceanic connections, if you so want. They are taken from different aspects of the cultural spectrum. Of course, I will provide you with some literary examples, but also identity politics and memory or past futures of extinction, which I'm going to show you in a minute. Let's start with a pretty straightforward case of memory politics. So identity politics via the recourse to the past. What you can see here, and I hope you can see it also clear enough, that former Kenyan President Uhuru Kenyatta awards the status of the 44th tribe to Kenya's Indian diaspora, or people of Indian descent who live in Kenya. And this is a specifically, how can I say that, gesture of validating the Indian presence in Kenya, but also, of course, references a specific historical legacy, and that is that of indentured labor. That is the system of forced labor migration that came after slavery and was supposed to be more humane, more driven by the needs of the worker in terms of, you were given contracts, you were given land in exchange for your lifetime commitment to being an indentured laborer, but of course you were shipped to the colonies, basically, to the English colonies. In this case, we have, again, the Indian indentured laborers and their descendants who were moved from Asia to Africa, in this specific case to Kenya, and of course settled there, had children, had subsequent generations, and framed their identity as a Kenyan diaspora, or as an Indian diaspora in Kenya, I should say, around this legacy of indenture. Here it is framed in a positive way, right? It is the president who says, okay, elections are around the corner. I'm going to award you this, prestigious status of being included into the tribal structure of Kenya. But of course, this narrative neglects the harshness, of course, the oppression, the violence that came with the system of indentured laborers, right? So this is one case or one example where memory politics and kind of a memory narrative is created that neglects certain parts but is made to be used for a specific purpose. And this purpose is to highlight Afrasian solidarities, right? So Africa-Asian solidarities. My second example comes, I hope you can see that. That is a shot from above of the island on which Mount Tambora is existing. It is in Indonesia, or what we today understand as Indonesia, and in 1815, this mount erupted and killed almost 900,000 people in the process, not necessarily due to the eruption itself, but due to the mass deaths of starvation that were the result of the specific outbreak. The outbreak was so huge, and the kind of clouds of ash that were catapulted into the sky actually overtook large parts of the northern hemisphere of the globe and created what is now in hindsight called a year without summer. So even where, hotter climates were, a given, people had no summer. It was very foggy. It was very rainy. It was very, unusual climate as the result of this huge eruption, right? There are several myths that rank around this outbreak, okay? Ones that you can actually, verify in terms of historical records. One is, and I find that slightly hilarious of sorts, is that Napoleon was unable to win Waterloo simply because he couldn't see. Huh? The weather was so bad that he, failed in his whatever he was doing, and, hence was defeated. The other myth that is created around that outbreak is that the mood in that year without summer was so, dark and depressing that it kind of enabled Gothic writing, that it enabled Mary Shelley to come up with Frankenstein and this whole, dark outlook on science, on, what it means to be human, what it means not to be human, and this idea of, creating a life that is not necessarily meant to live in a way, right? So again, these are myths that are somewhat, building around this actual historical event, the eruption of that specific volcano. In 2020, Guinevere Glassford, you can see that on the right-hand side, wrote a novel engaging with this historical legacy. And of course, it is a 2020 literary example in terms of that you have to provide a certain multi-perspectivity, right? It is a text that is written to represent multiple identity positions that are, also somewhat relating to that outbreak of the volcano. So we have a ship surgeon, Mr. Henry Hogg, who's sent to investigate the outbreak in and of itself, and, describes or relates to the reader how paradise has turned into, at least a nightmare. Then we go to Switzerland, and of course a fictitious or fictional Mary Shelley witnesses how, the climate refugees walk past her door. It's not a very subtle novel. Yeah, I'm just trying to make a point here. She walks, these climate refugees pass outside of her door, and she's like, and now I'm going to write, my Frankenstein story. Again, this myth is taken up here. Then we go to the United States, to Vermont, where we encounter a preacher, Charles Whitlock, who guides his flock through drought and starvation. Again, direct results of that outbreak, but we get a literary perspective, right? A fictional perspective on that. We go to England, where a painter, grapples with the loss of his idyllic England and is now, faced with the task of artistically representing this, again, doomed kind of mood that's in the air. And that, of course, relates to William Turner, and his, how can I say that, sublime, almost negatively sublime renditions of, the sea, the sky, the divine powers, right? And what we do not, interestingly enough, encounter in this specific novel are non-Western perspectives, like Indonesian, Asian perspectives on the matter, right, on the outbreak. This, of course, can be explained in two ways. Again, identity politics. This is a white European author who might say, I will refrain from adapting a position that is not mine. Thus, I am trying to, invent cultural memories that I can actually relate to, right? But on the other hand, isn't art, as usual, or that's my usual argument, the space where you should be able to explore positions that are not uniquely yours or that you have a connection to. Right? So that is the second example. The third example is one that I find highly intriguing. Also, if someone's interested in kind of digital memory studies, that might be something to explore. And that is the case of the Pacific island of Tuvalu. I don't know if you've heard about that specific press conference that I think then the defense minister of this, I think he's foreign minister, of the tiny island gave. And of course, the effect of standing knee-deep in the ocean was deliberate. And the plight of that foreign minister towards, the nation's meeting for the COP, I think it was 2021, so the climate conference, right, the worldwide climate conference, was to say we are drowning, right? Sea levels are rising to an extent that, and you can see that here, of course, this is the sea, and that is the island, right? So the ocean has closed in on that island to an extent that it will disappear within the next 40 or 50 years, right? And this is an example, in my view, of two things. It's one thing, it is the discrepancy between global north versus global south effects of climate change, right? It is a question of who is visible, who needs to, go through specific lengths, be inventive to be able to be seen, right? And thirdly, what do we do, or what do collective societies do when faced with the threat of, extinction, of just drowning in the seas? And that is to find a way of, recreating themselves, or that is Tuvalu's idea. And the idea is to create a digital version of the island in the metaverse, which people who are not, either from there or come from, subsequent generations will be able to experience the island, in a form before it was, again, taken back, if you so want, by the ocean, right? And this is something that Reinhard Koselleck would have described or framed as a notion of future past. So we're looking into the future, creating a sense of newly configured island in the metaverse, which of course is a past version of the island, because by then the island would have been gone, right? So again, kind of an interesting way of framing experience in and of time and looking towards the future when faced by extinction. These examples shed hopefully a light on how these, categories go together. And this is a rendition of how I understand these things and how they connect, and consider that a kind of a bird's eye view, not a hierarchy that I'm referencing here, okay? So Anthropocene, the question of, climate change, the question of what role do we as humans play in that specific context matters, as well as, again, how do we frame our experience in and of time, right? Post-colonial studies with regard to the question of, who's visible, who has a voice, who can, represent, and who's also marketed in terms of literary markets and so on and so forth. And of course, the notion, question, and development of what we might call environmental or blue humanities. And all of these things taken together, for me, result into something that I have framed tentatively as geomnemonics, meaning there is a certain way of framing memory that is in relation to geopolitics, so creation of spaces, of realms of remembering, that cut across borders, that cut across geopolitical spaces like global north, global south, Northern American, European versus the rest, and so on and so forth. You probably know the drill, right? So there are different forms of geopolitics, if you so want, that are created through this recurrence or the introduction of memory, of remembering a collective past. And of course the notion of geopoetics, so to what extent contribute literary imaginations, in my case, to the understanding of both geopolitics, but also the way we remember. Okay? And that leads me, obviously, to the, how can I say that, research context, the theoretical background that I'm using, and I've already hinted at, and that I'm going to introduce to you in a little more depth and hopefully not, relating back to you things that you already know or in some way. I think the most visible or the most straightforward or also perhaps the most popular, if I may be so bold, access here is that of the Anthropocene, right? This is a notion that has, I would argue, affected literary, cultural studies to a great extent, right? It's one of these concepts, one of these, I would say, Schlagwörter almost, right? Rallying cries that have impacted our thinking and also the way we do research in terms of to what extent do we need to be able to activate people, to teach, to educate, to render this a case of activism much more than, research. So the Anthropocene is an interesting case because it was used to frame a specific geological time, right? I don't know if you've heard about the Holocene. That is the current way of framing our time, right? The period of warmth, relative warmth that's been ongoing for I don't know how long, and that has enabled humankind to be as, productive as we are, right? And to develop into the different forms that we've developed into, for better or for worse, right? And so there was this attempt to say, okay, we need to break with this idea of the Holocene because something else has occurred. And that something else is that humans have become a geological force in our own right. We leave marks on the, stratums, on the material identity, material formations that is our planet, okay? This is obviously referenced here. I hope you can see that there's some plastic in and among the layers of sand that you can see here, thus the layers of time, right? And there was a debate, when did the Anthropocene start? Was that the invention of, the steam engine? Was that, at the point when people were actually, taking farming to a different level, that it wasn't, only supposed to sustain individual families or communities, but that has, developed into a form of economic trade and so on and so forth? Or is that, has the Anthropocene begun even earlier when you think of indigenous communities and their way of, using fire to enable, farming and growing and so on and so forth on their specific land, right? So there's a debate ongoing. And this is neatly summarized by Paul Crutzen, who has obviously been the father, so to speak, of that idea of the Anthropocene, right? When he writes, for the past 3 centuries, the effects of humans on the global environment have escalated. Because of these anthropogenic emissions of carbon dioxide, global climate may depart significantly from natural behavior for many millennia to come. It seems appropriate to assign them the term Anthropocene to the present, human-dominated geological epoch supplementing the Holocene. The warm period of the past 10 to 12 millennia. Now you know how long it's been going on. The Anthropocene could be said to have started in the latter part of the 18th century when analyses of air trapped in the polar ice showed the beginning of growing global concentrations of carbon dioxide and methane. This date also happens to coincide with James Watts's design of the steam engine in 1784, right? So what is the major shift or the major shift in our understanding of what research is and also our understanding of what time and the experience of time is, right? First and foremost, it highlights a point of crystallization, right? So when the forces of human productivity have become so, relentless on the planet that it is, from henceforth impossible to deny our presence, right, on the planet. Then secondly, it is a realization that we live, in an entangled state with our natural environment, as opposed to, 18th, 19th, perhaps 20th century narratives of we, cultivate the environment for our purposes, right? So there's a lot of human agency versus little natural agency. And these, scales are tipping. These things are changing. So that is, in a sense, also a reference of inverted or slightly changed power relations, again, between human agency and agency of nature of the environment, right? And also, the relationship between humans and the environment needs to be projected into the future, right? We need to kind of derive solutions, but at least ideas about what our future looks like, if, and that is not an if, but, when the climate is going to collapse, right? And in that context, I fully and enthusiastically recommend to read Deepesh Chakrabarty, if you haven't already done so, who frames the notion of the climate of history, in the Anthropocene. And he highlights the following points, and again, this is tying into what I just said. Natural history becomes human history, and this is the first time, again, in the history of humans, that we, have to frame our existence on the planet and the visions of the future that we derive from that connection with regard to natural history, right? The Anthropocene, secondly, forces us to think beyond discrete events if we frame history. So we cannot, for example, think about 9/11. That would be a kind of more or less discrete historical event, storming of the Bastille, Some say colonialism is a historical event that, stretched on for quite a while. But being faced with these time scales and with these centerless, flares of forest fires, of, rising sea levels, of droughts, of floods, of whatever you can think of, right? Forces to abandon this, there is a need, kind of temporal frame that you can draw around these Anthropocene times, right? And we have to start to think about structures, processes, continuities on larger scale time frames at the end of the day, right? We need to be able to find ways to experience and organize time beyond our kind of cultural notions of time, right? Day, week, generation, epoch, and so on and so forth. All these notions are usually tied to human history, right? To our identity in time. And of course, origin stories, right? If you think about Western modernity, the notion of progress, right? The notion of globalization and capitalism. Of course, we are all, I would say, of the generation that we don't consider these to be, straightforwardly positive developments, right? But again, the notion of human progress has to be reframed in terms of their detrimental effects on the environment, but also the detrimental effects on other people when you think of colonialism, post-colonialism, and so on and so forth. So again, origin stories that have been framed as positive need to be reconfigured in a way, right? And here, the role of the arts, and here I'm pointing towards Amitav Ghosh and The Great Derangement, also a very worthy read, is that the role of arts and the role of literary imagination, cultural imagination is, potentially as important as it's never been before, because we need to find ways to relate all of this information, all of this, to the people. So if the climate crisis is also a crisis of narrative, as Amitav Ghosh puts forth. So again, what can we do in order to alleviate that and to find ways of imagining future or future pasts? All right, so that's the Anthropocene. Now I'm going to very briefly introduce you to the notion of the blue humanities. Perhaps you've already heard of that. And this is another interesting way in which, research develops or research fields develops. And this is why I brought this rather lengthy quote here to highlight, again, the processes behind that. So John Gillis says, although fully half of the world's people now live within 100 miles of an ocean, few today have working knowledge of the sea. As a science, oceanography, I think I'm always stumbling over this word, is still in its infancy. more is known about the dark side of the moon than is known about the depths of the ocean, writes sea explorer David Hallberg. Yet large numbers of people know the sea in other ways through the arts and literature. From the beginning of the 19th century, fiction has been imagining sea worlds that explorers were unable to reach. Rachel Carson, who did as much as anyone to open up the marine sciences, was inspired by the arts of literature. She wrote in 1951 that humans were destined to return to the sea, from which they had emerged eons earlier. But this time they would do so mentally and imaginatively. This cultural turn to the sea began in the late 18th and early 19th century, and by now there is a vast trove of writing, painting, and music that awaits examination under the rubric of what English professor Steve Mance would like us to call the blue humanities. So what does that quote say? On the one hand, blue humanities is something that became big in the perhaps 20th century, but now really in the 21st century, right? If you just look across research funding that is given out or research projects with an environmental angle to them, a lot of it is connected to, notions of water bodies, of, mobility on water bodies, and so on and so forth. But what Mr. Gillis also says, that is not a recent phenomenon. It's not something, that people turn to in the 20th or 21st century, but at least has been present since, of course, the dawn of colonialism, right? And the dawn of people having or wanting to traverse large bodies of water to make the world their own, and to engage with other contexts than their own, right? And this is what my habilitation is trying to say, right? Of course, I'm coining this notion, but this is something that I can trace back to at least Robinson Crusoe, to at least Treasure Island, to at least, all these adventure narratives that are part and parcel of our English literature canon, if you so want. And of course, here I'm putting on my post-colonial studies hat. Post-colonial studies had already been, engaging with oceanic formations before I would argue blue humanities became a thing, right? And how is that? Of course, because of the very prominent position that oceans hold in the whole colonial endeavor, right? And also in the post-colonial endeavor. I will show you a little bit about that in a second, right? But of course, one of the most prominent oceanic paradigms that was, or that derived from this specific position, or this very important position of oceanic spaces in colonialism, was the Black Atlantic paradigm, Paul Gilroy, right? So from the legacy of the triangular slave trade, he coined the notion of the Black Atlantic to say there is a supranational community that has, developed out of people being forcibly moved into different cultures, right? And the national frame, or a kind of a singular cultural frame, is unable to contain or to explain the identity formations that are the result of that. Again, this is a historical legacy, right? So the post-colonial, or the colonial legacy of the slave trade, right? That is then turned into something through which you can explain the present, through which you can explain African-American presence, cultures, aesthetics, and so on and so forth in America. But you can also, look back to Africa, for example, and see how that, plays out in these contexts. So the Black Atlantic was a transnational unit of analysis and emphasizes, and that is one of the arguably perhaps weaker points of that idea, is that it is about looking at identities, histories, and legacy out of Africa, right? That were moved out of Africa and into different contexts, right? And Atlantic readings of slavery, were used in order to highlight, of course, the legacies of colonialism, legacies of oppression, legacies of violence, but also to see how, boundaries between the free and enslaved, are racially coined, right? Are strongly connected to the color of skin and to your cultural background, right? And this Black Atlantic paradigm, although it says, the national frame cannot contain Black Atlantic identities, is still somewhat, has a foot in this idea of there are national communities from which people hail and also to which people are transposed into, right? But that was one of the I would say, most visible attempts of, not attempts, but, ideas of engaging with the oceanic space in post-colonial and colonial studies. In recent decades, I should probably say, there's another oceanic paradigm that has very prominently emerged, and that is the Indian Ocean studies. And Indian Ocean studies, to my understanding, was trying to produce a counterpoint to the Black Atlantic narrative. Because people from the Indian Ocean context, scholars from the Indian Ocean context, and perhaps even writers from the Indian Ocean context, were concerned that, and I'm trying to put this out there, in the most neutral of forms, that the transatlantic slave trade is occupying a lot of attention, in doing research, in framing text and framing aesthetics, and that pushes aside other, difficult legacies from colonialism. I was mentioning the indentured labor scheme, but also, the identity and histories of those societies before and after colonialism, right? So the Black Atlantic forces us into the colonial framework, if you so want, whilst the Indian Ocean studies representatives would argue, there's something before colonialism that has something to do with oceanic mobilities, and we cannot, frame our identities solely as victims, survivors, and, post-colonial identities, right? But we have to be more inclusive in that. And so there were a number of, approaches coined. I've mentioned a few here. I don't know if all of them are, fully productive, but I think you can at least get a grasp of how that works. Yeah? Mohan speaks of waterscapes, right, as opposed to landscapes, and I think you can see, again, where this paradigm is going. It moves away from land-based ideas of identity. I've mentioned the nation as perhaps the most prominent one, right? But there are also, colonial notions of land that are so prominent, right? You may have heard about the Terra Nullius Declaration, so you go somewhere and say, hey, this land doesn't belong to anyone, so now it belongs to the British Crown. But of course there were, indigenous people present, and before, British colonialists came, right? So waterscape, again, tries to point us towards other ideas of framing identities and histories, and here in relation to water, right? And not even necessarily just the ocean. Mohan also speaks of amphibious societies, highlighting the epistemological position of societies living and making use of oceanic spaces, right? So this idea of being able to move on land and on water simultaneously, right? Ancient cosmopolitanisms is something that Isabel Hofmeier has coined, right? So the idea of people were world travelers before the notion was, was invented by some European writer, right? So this idea that vast areas and vast contexts of knowledge had to be traversed even before, again, colonialism was a thing, right, and was in place. And of course, the idea of oceanic studies does not, refrain itself to the ocean itself, but also things with the littoral structures, which are, beaches, the transitioning spaces between water where land and water meet, right? And these have come to signify a specific non-static idea of identity as encounter, identity as something that you negotiate, that is not fixed, and that, comes to develop in the moment of encounter, right? And also specifically in the moment of transcultural encounter, right? And of course, if you're interested in the idea of world literature as a comparative frame, you can use that, the oceanic paradigms, as a way of, forming such world literature frameworks of comparison. I'll say a bit about that in a second, right? So 2 things to take away. Yes, the Anthropocene, blue humanities, is big now, if I may be so, polemic. But all of these questions, or many of these questions, have already been part and parcel of, previous, schools of thought, if you so want. And now I'm moving over to memory studies and the idea of how do we frame our existence in time, and how does that actually work on a collective level? Because I think everyone is on board that memory is an individual thing, right? It's something that happens in your head, that you tell or share with someone else, that you put into language, either in your head or by virtue of sharing with someone else, right? It is a way of situating yourself in your own life, right? If you tell your story, if you're asked by someone, how did you arrive at, sitting here this afternoon, you can tell a story how that came about, how you chose your study program and so on and so forth, right? So there's a whole tradition, right, of understanding memory as an individual thing. You can, mention, of course, religious and spiritual contexts, or, notion of introspection that perhaps was most prominently put forth by St. Augustine. Also a very interesting read. Of course, you have this philosophical notion of individualism, right, of something happening in your head that perhaps, and I'm not an expert here, surprisingly so, is of course Bergson's philosophy, right, of the individual and the individual memory, and of course not to mention Freud and his whole idea of the importance of not remembering or repressing, or, the notion of traumatic memory and recall. And in the early 20th century, scholars, and this is one of the great ironies, and irony is not even the right word here because it's such a tragic story, right? But in the early century, Maurice Halbwachs started to think about the notion of collective memory, so that there are shareable pasts and shared pasts that cut across the individual frame. And that doesn't necessarily mean if 2 people share their experience, but, broader frames of sharing your ideas about the past. And what is ironic about this, and again, this is not the right word, Maurice Halbwachs died in the concentration camps before his work could be published, right? And was posthumously published by his daughter. So one of the great thinkers of, of collective memory, or the founding fathers, again, died at the hands of the Nazi regime, and the Holocaust and the individual as well of collective attempts to rework that legacy. Think about the painful struggle to find ways of expressing, of representing what was going on, right, in the death camps and during the Holocaust, drove this field. And again, his founding father never witnessed, right, the emergence of that field. But there are also other thinkers who started to think about this idea of collective memory. Abi Warburg, for example, traces how images of, the classical period kind of travel through the context and travel through time. And he has collected a whole plethora of different ways in which, again, classical motifs travel through time. And Jan Assmann, who was interested in the ancient Egyptian cultures and how certain, ideas of monotheism and so on and so forth have translated into our religion today. So again, this marked the change of idea of what memory is, right? But beyond the individual and towards the collective. And one of the key points to understand that memory is socio-culturally conditioned and constructed, both in the ways we receive other people's or other collectives' memory and the ways we construct them ourselves, right? They are ultimately shareable. They are very, very much related to images of the self, right? So self in terms of collective self and agency. So who does the remembering? Who can remember? Who's heard, right? And who is not? This is, of course, the central question to post-colonial memory. But again, in this first wave, Maurice Halbwachs and others were more interested in the social frames of memory. So religion, class, history, tradition, in which way do they, frame the way we remember? Then there came the second wave, and this wave construction is something that my mentor Astrid Erl has come up with in order to, describe the different developments that the field of memory studies went through, right? So the second wave saw a nationalization of memory studies and, the methods of doing memory research. And I think the most prominent name here to mention is Pierre Nora, who coined the notion of the realms of memory, so that there are certain spaces, and space is a very metaphorical, and place. Both space and place are very metaphorical, or metaphorically used here in terms of a Madeleine can be a place of French memory, because, at the moment you eat the Madeleine, you are reminded of the great tradition of, French national identity, right? Or that you go to Verdun and you immediately, get a sense of what the First World War means for a national French memory, right? And I think we can all agree, yeah, there's a certain validity to that. And the kind of point of contention that Pierre Nora put forth is because there is increasingly living memory present, right? Think about soldiers of the First World War, they're not alive anymore. So we need spaces and places to go that recreate that milieu of mémoire that disappeared because, witnesses disappear. You can, of course, think about that in the context of the Holocaust and ever increasingly so perhaps also in post-colonial context, right? So collective memory here functioned as a way of delineating your own group, and that was the national group, right? This is us, and this is not us, right? This is not French memory, or this is not, French identity. These are, of course, broad strokes, right? Then there is the third wave, and to a great extent we're still in that third phase, or wave, right? And that is the transcultural and transnational turn, specifically driven by Astrid Erl and Rigney, Richard Crownshaw, and Dani Levy. So the idea is, again, also that the national frame cannot and does not, explain any and all of the connections that are created through remembering together, right? So there's an idea of almost globally circulating memory frames. The Holocaust would be one of those, right? And that led to the framing of the notion of cosmopolitan memory, so that because we remember the Holocaust in a specific way, we are better people for it, right? So there's a lesson to be learned from, Holocaust memory that should introduce an ethical dimension to our present and our future. Alas, I think that project was a failure, or at least to a large extent, right? But again, that was the idea of creating memory frameworks and memory paradigms that explain, the connection that could not be denied. And of course, the very famous, I would argue, notion of traveling memory that Astrid Erl coined, saying collective memory is so much dependent on and reflected by media regimes. Think about one novel that travels to a different context and is read by a different audience, and that does something to the audience that receives that particular novel. Yeah? And the theory is that by virtue of travel, of memories being able to travel via media regimes, via people who travel to different contexts, right? That there's a notion of cultural or transcultural encounter through relating memory to each other, right? And curiously enough, I have to say, there's not a whole lot of memory studies present in this idea of memory studies, in the third wave of memory studies. We can debate why that is, why that might be. But one of the few thinkers who put kind of post-colonialism on the agenda of memory studies was Michael Rothberg, by coining his notions of multi-directional memory. And he basically says, Holocaust memory enables other collectives to remember their traumatic history. because it's such a well-known, memory paradigm. You can relate your own story. Think about the Armenian genocide, for example, in terms of Holocaust memory, right? And of course, the major criticism that he faced is, why do you have to think through the Holocaust to, a post-colonial context? Why do you need that gatekeeper or gate opener, right? So again, we're in infancy, or the field is in its infancy, I would argue, in that regard. But it's already, ventured towards the environmental, the Anthropocene. Again, this is one of the points that I'm trying to make. There are certain schools of thought, schools of traditions, research traditions that are now moving towards the environmental. And what I hope you've already understood from what I was saying is that there is a normative dimension, right, to remembering. So there's a right way to remember. There's a wrong way to remember. Of course, we as scholars are in the position of describing all of that, right? But, it gets even more normative when we come or move towards memory and Anthropocene. So, the basic questions that are asked, climate witnessing. So who witnesses, who, archives, who stores the memory of, I guess, humanity for, when we are not there anymore. There's the notion of slow memory. So how do we slow down our, idea of remembering? We cannot just, create one day in a year that says, this is the commemorative day of the extinction of the human species or something like that. We need to think about other ideas here. And of course, there's the notion of post-humanism. So what agency, again, has the environment developed with the context of remembering, and how and to what extent are we able to introduce, non-European, non-North American epistemologies of remembering into this whole field, right? So by that time, and I'm looking at the clock, I'm taking a whole lot of time with this introductory phase. I'm going to skip about the literature and memory part in a second. I think what is important to take away here is that by the fourth wave, or by now, a field has formed, right? And an idea of what memory means has formed. And that is an umbrella term for all those processes of a biological, medial, or social nature, which relate past, present, and future, right? And again, the central characteristics here are relationship to and function in the present, the constructed nature, subjective, very highly selective processes of remembering, You decide what to remember on a collective scale, and, on pushback other memories in that. And, the important part here is the process of selecting, again, what is remembered and what is not. For the enthusiasts, and I'm happy to provide, you with my PowerPoint later, that is a way of, comparing why memory and literature go together this, amazingly, at least in my view, because there are similar processes behind literary fiction, the way it engages with an outer fictional reality, the way it transforms it, the way it condenses certain things, and so on and so forth. There's a, again, there's a linkage between collective memory processes and the way, fiction and stories is created. Okay? Again, for the enthusiasts, you're very welcome to look at that later. So what I'm trying to coin here, bringing all of these strands that I've introduced to you together, is again the notion of geomnemonics. So there's a way of framing, temporal spatial organizations via the process of remembering, and oceans take on different functions here, right? Ocean structure, our idea of where we come from, where we go. So it's important, to understand the impact that your own geography has on your sense of self, and, translate that into a collective setting. Of course, oceans are historic spaces and spaces of mobility for, better or for worse. I've introduced you briefly to the colonial legacies here. But of course, it is again a somewhat limiting perspective if you only understand oceans in terms of their, colonial legacies. Oceans form ideational networks, or, cater to ideational networks, as I will introduce you in a second when I show you the literary examples that I've been dealing with, right? So, your relationship or a collective's relationship to the ocean can be used as, again, framing citizenship, framing belonging, and so on and so forth. In literary studies, there's been recently coined the notion of eco-narratology. So there's again a sub-strand of studying of how literary texts deploy environmental forms to organize their text, right? And of course, again, such an oceanic perspective hopefully is able to introduce epistemologies in and of representing time and the experience of time, right? All right, that's it with the theory. I'm going to take, if that's all right, 5-7 more minutes. And I will also skip potentially the close reading part, but again, I'm happy to provide you with all of this later. So where do you find, or where do I find transoceanic memory in the vast corpus of Anglophone literatures? Of course, very prominently present is the aforementioned pre-colonial system and routes, right? So I would argue specifically 20th, 21st century authors make a point about highlighting non-colonial, systems of exchange and mobility in order to say we're not only framing ourselves with relation to that specific background, right? And as an example here, Abdul Razak Gurna's Paradise, with a view to all sorts of connectivities that emerge at the East African coast. Then, of course, again, also understandably very prominent are the transoceanic memories of forced labor migration, slavery, the triangular trade, indentured labor. And here you also find historical sources of, slaves, of indentured laborers that you can actually study. You might have heard about Olaudah Equiano and his, rendition of his time as a slave and then his release, in inverted commas, into freedom. You have Mary Prince's account of being a housemaid, house slave, right? And this is an interesting text because she was not allowed to produce the text herself. She had a male white editor who then, formed the text or shaped it into the text that we know today. But again, there are also very prominent 21st century authors. Cara Phillips, you've surely heard about him, M.G. Vasanji, and Eishi Idugyan from the Canadian context. Again, all interested in exploring the legacies of indentured labor and slavery. Then there is, interestingly enough, no, not interestingly enough, it's actually pretty straightforward, the importance of the world wars for, non-European, non-Northern American context. And specifically, the First World War was used to pave the way towards independence for some states. Think about Canada in that context. Think about Australia, again, who's interested in that. And the idea is that a participation in a world war that was not instigated in the colonies, but then was turned into a legacy that, could be positively framed, or could be framed as something enabling rather than crippling, with all its problems that come with it. And of course, we also have transoceanic memory in Anglophone literature in terms of non-European imperialisms. I'm thinking about the Chinese, different Chinese empires here, right? And specifically the role they played in the East African coastline and the kind of diplomatic connections that were formed there, again, before one of the colonizers had set foot on any of the continents, right? Then in the early 19th century, opium wars, which are, of course, colonial wars in origin, but this is not, as that simple in terms of, who the players and who the beneficiaries of that opium war was. And of course, and here, this is a novel that I highly recommend should you be interested in any of these oceanic contexts. The Dragonfly Sea from Yvonne Adiambo-Uvuo, who, puts forth the ways in which communities connect to water, the thing that I've already mentioned to you, right? So what these texts all have in common, at least this is how I'm reading it, is, again, to bring together the agency of the aesthetic, again, this notion of selecting what is important to one specific community or to, many communities, and organize this into a literary text and creating some effects. One of the effects is the shifting of the center-periphery model, meaning, these literatures are not centrally engaged in, exploring the global north versus global south situation, but are more interested in, diversifying the positions and diversifying the memories of that. They access entangled history, they enable us to understand how the Opium Wars go together with Chinese imperialism and also French colonialism and so on and so forth. So they teach us a certain, thing about the eventlessness, actually, but more the kind of relationality of memory and historical remembrance. They rearrange national narratives, so there's no, glory to Kenyan independence, or little glory to Kenyan independence, or, little glory to other contexts in that sense. And all of these texts argue again against these well-received global north, global south, victim, perpetrator dichotomies. I would have a close reading, but I don't know if that... Yeah? Am I boring you already, or are you still here? All right, so this is one of my case studies, right? This is Amitav Ghosh's Ibis trilogy. And Amitav Ghosh, of course, is one of the writers that some say has been waiting for the Nobel Prize for Literature for centuries and has never been, awarded this prestigious prize. But he is a mainstay, right? He's one of the main representatives of what you could call, or don't have to call, post-colonial literature. But for me, he's one of the most prominent transoceanic writers, right? So why is that? First of all, if you think about his identity, his professional identity, right? He writes fictional texts, he writes non-fictional texts. Again, I'm highly recommending The Great Derangement to you, or The Nutmeg's Curse. Some of you might have heard about that. That's his most, successful non-fictional text. He's frequently labeled as an Indian writer, but he is probably best described as, truly situated in between cultures. So he was born in Calcutta, grew up in India, in Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. He studied anthropology in Delhi, in Oxford, and Egypt, Alexandria. And he currently resides in the United States, right? So how do we label an author like that? I think he's mostly interested in exploring the conditions of the Anthropocene, specifically from a global south perspective, if you so want, right? So how are colonialism, globalization, and capitalism complicit in bringing about the Anthropocene, right? And what can literary imagination do to alleviate or to, present alternatives? And the Ibis trilogy is also one of his most successful literary endeavors in that case. And it consists of 3 novels, which were published in between 2008 and 2015. It's Sea of Poppies, which I'm focusing on today, River of Smoke, and Flood of Fire. Highly recommended. My students loved it, so I hope that you would be interested too. It is set before and during the Opium Wars of the 1830s. I've already talked to you about that. And all of the 3 novels engage to varying degrees with British and French imperialism, but also indentured forced labor, class, ethnicity, in pre-colonial India, and also, of course, in colonial India. Yeah? And Ghosh, in these 3 texts, right, unfolds far-reaching plots. So they are not, limited to a specific geopolitical space, but plays them out against very localized and mostly subaltern histories, right? So we have all sorts of characters that are not on the top shelf of the colonial hierarchy, right? In that sense, it creates the three texts. They create micro-histories, right? So they take on the perspective of an indentured laborer, of a lascar, kind of a sailor on specific ships, right? And relays these grand historical narratives through the perspective of someone who's, on the bottom of the colonial ladder, if you so want. And thus, it's not a happy-clappy cosmopolitan worldview, right, that he transports. But there's a whole lot of actual and epistemological violence and, distributes also agency to commit violence across the board, right? So again, it's not this simple matrix colonizer versus colonized, good versus bad, but there are all sorts of, in-between situations to be found in. And on the level of form, Goethe's novels makes use of traditional memory forms, first and foremost, the trilogy, right? So there's a connection created. We meet characters again and again throughout these three novels, and there's a certain sense of continuity that is evoked here, right? So there's a certain temporal depth. We can follow characters through, longer periods of time, and thus lend some memory, mnemonic depth to the endeavor, right? And the plots are held together by reoccurring characters, as I've already said, for example. DT, and I'm going to introduce you to a passage that DT relates to us as the focalizer, and she's an Indian, actually middle-class woman who's fallen from grace because her husband died. And if you have an idea of the caste system or the pre-colonial caste system, she is supposed to die with him, right? She is supposed to commit suicide. That is, the way it was. And she escapes her certain death by hiding as an indentured laborer, by boarding one of these ships, and by, being sold into mostly the Caribbean as a plantation worker, and so on and so forth. But, spoiler alert, she will never get there, and of course become an indentured laborer, right? We meet all sorts of other characters here. For example, in Zachary, he's an American sailor, descendant of former slaves, who then becomes one of these, characters that are somewhat situated in between victim-perpetrator, implicated in, the colonial hierarchy, in oppressing other people, but also trying to make his own, way and carving out his own space here. But what I'm trying to get at, and that is my almost last point, is the way in which the narrative or the texts are organized, and they are organized around ships. So as you could already see from at least the title of the trilogy, Ibis trilogy, the Ibis is the first ship and the first thing as it comes that DT, the main focalizer of Sea of Poppies, encounters, right? And these are the very first 3 sentences of the very first novel, right? So that's the first thing that both DT as well as, we as readers encounter. And it goes like this. The vision of a tall masted ship at sail on the ocean came to DT on an otherwise ordinary day. But she knew instantly that the apparition was a sign of destiny, for she had never seen such a vessel before, not even in a dream. How could she have, living as she did on northern Bihar, found 400 miles from the coast? Her village was so far inland, and the sea seemed as distant as the netherworld. It was a chasm of darkness where the holy Ganga disappeared into the Kalapani, the black water. So here we can see how important information about the character DT and her situation is subtly conveyed. Living inland means being removed from the possible openness of the littoral, the coastal areas, never having seen a ship at the height of imperial rule, right, speaks even more to her isolation. The reference here of black water signals to the initiated reader who knows about the caste system that the threat of losing caste by crossing the ocean is prominent. Yet she implicitly knows that destiny has something else for her in store. And all of that is relayed through DT's vision of a ship. And it's not a saint or a ghost or a spirit, but a structure, a wooden structure of, a structure of wood that holds so much power in the colonial enterprise. It promises mobility, potentially a different life, but also brings with it the existential threat of losing caste. It is the prominent position of the ship at the very beginning of the trilogy that signals its central importance. And throughout the other novels that follow, other ships become, the anchor of the narrative, right? The next one's the Anahita, and in the third one, it's the Redruth. So there are, ships that are the central characters, if you so want, central protagonists. And this is, as the plot unfolds, the Ibis becomes the space here of transcultural encounter. Indian indentured workers board this former slave vessel that still bears the traces of the shackles and the Middle Passage agony. On the ibis, on the ship, a descendant of former slave climbs the metaphorical ladder and becomes second in command. A formerly wealthy Rajar, so a local, not politician, local lord, so to speak, loses his estate and is sentenced to 7 years of confinement on a labor camp on Mauritius, and they all come to meet on this ship, right? And again, spoiler alert, the ship then decides who gets to arrive at their destination. And there's nothing magical involved here, or nothing, anthropomorphic about the ship. But the ship has a whole lot of agency, as does the ocean, okay? So that is, for me, a way of framing, of understanding the transoceanic, right? It's, for me, there on 3 levels. On the level of plot and historical context, I think this is pretty obvious. We are invited to follow a large number of characters through their respective life journeys, right? They hail from different parts of the Indian Ocean world and belong to different social backgrounds. But the narrative, and this is important here, points beyond the geopolitical confines of the Indian Ocean world, right? It points towards much larger context through the subtle invocation of the transatlantic slave trade, for example. And secondly, it is on the ocean that they come to meet. It's on the specific ship that all of these different identities, history, and legacies come to meet and, are actually and effectively entangled. And instead of tying notions of belonging and identity to land and nation, which would have been, the way of framing it for a long time, with regard to empire and colonies, and now all the characters of the 3 novels frame their identities around ships, right? Around ocean, around water epistemologies, and thus conceive identities and histories as open-ended, as mobile, as possessual, but also liminal. Okay? And on that note, I am moving over to my conclusions, which I hope make sense to you after this onslaught of information that I brought today. So, my idea of the transoceanic enables me, again, to follow this shift of perspective that the Anglophone literatures that I introduced you to, present me with, and thus speak to, I guess, a larger way, larger processes of framing history, identities, and, the way we situate ourselves in time. And thus, for me, oceans are both metaphor, and ideational space, so a space on which we can imagine, on which, we can use as an arena to play out plots or to, situate identities. It can become an archive in the way of which it releases or withholds certain, historical artifacts, and, enables a somewhat interdisciplinary approach to what that means. But it is, of course, also a concrete environment, right? It is an environmental form that we can study and that we can seek and how it is deployed in literary texts, in my case, but also, again, in which other ways and forms we might perceive it. And so, for me, the transoceanic enables me to understand the ocean and transcultural forms of remembering and representing in and around the oceanic space, and, as a way of theorizing, perhaps, the interaction between the human and the non-human. And thus, I hope to have shown that, for me, the transoceanic memory, again, is not the great theory that explains the world, but it is a mode of remembering, so a mode that I find in literary texts, that I find, in adjacent media cultures. And in that sense, it is relational. It perceives identity as a practice, as open-ended, transcultural, mobile. But this is not necessarily always positive, This is not necessarily always happy-clappy, as I said earlier, right? These are all processes that involve friction, that involve contention. But I think from a vantage point of doing research, I think it's there, right? It can be a mode of comparison, so you can read different texts through this transoceanic. So from the mobile, from the, open-ended towards the more narrowly framed, and it provides me with, and this is my last point, obviously, material to study, right? And with a view to, again, interdisciplinary research, which I think is the future, or has to be the future of humanities, you know, that we can develop perhaps a vocabulary and and ideas how to do interdisciplinary research. And on that note, I apologize for taking too much time, and thank you for your attention, and if you have any questions, feel free to drop me an email. Thank you.